Welcome, welcome everybody. And this is our last session of our study of the children of Israel's journey from the sea to Sinai. Shavuot is this weekend, so we're going to finish it up. We're going to read two interesting passages. First, about another episode of them getting thirsty and complaining, and the other, the attack by Amalek, which in a very important chapter in the Torah and later thought. And next week we'll begin a whole new course of study, and we'll over the next 2 months we'll be continuing to look at the narrative sections of the Torah through the commentaries, and we'll be looking at the travels of the children of Israel from Sinai onward to the Promised Land. So there's a lot more narrative, so we might have to pick and choose a little bit. But we're going to look, as we're doing now, in depth at some stories and seeing how it applies and how it's relevant. And again, I'm not sure how we'll do it then. I'm still thinking about it. But our methodology for this first step of the children of Israel's journey has been to get into their minds, get into their hearts, get into their growth, because their journey has become symbolic of the journey of all of us in life, and all the growth that we all go through, and all the ways that our tradition believes God and the universe is always trying to train us to be more free, to reach our promised lands, to receive revelation. And so we are still ever the children of Israel traveling. So let's go to, we're going to begin, and we're going to be looking at the travels, beginning right after the whole episode of the manna, which we looked at last time. So we're chapter 17 of Exodus, and Alan is going to get us started.
Hey,
if he's willing.
Chat, can't fight me off. Chapter 17. From the wilderness of sin, the whole Israelite community continued by stages, as Adonai would command. They encamped at Rephidim, and there was no water for the people to drink. The people quarreled with Moses. "Give us water to drink," they said. And Moses replied to them, "Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you try Adonai?" But the people thirsted there for water, and the people grumbled against Moses and said, "Why did you bring us up from Egypt to kill us and our children and livestock with thirst?" Moses cried out to Adonai, saying, "What shall I do with this people? Before long, they will be stoning me." Then Adonai said to Moses, "Pass before the people, take with you some of the elders of Israel, and take along the rod with which you struck the Nile and set out. I will be standing there before you on the rock at Horeb. Strike the rock, and water will issue from it, and the people will drink." And Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel. The place was named Massah and Meribah, because the Israelites quarreled, and because they tried Adonai, saying, "Is Adonai present among us or not?"
Okay. So what do you make of this episode? Any thoughts? We had one similar 2 weeks ago. They're complaining about being thirsty again, not having water.
Good thing they didn't know about coffee back then.
I'm a little confused here, okay? People and animals need water. It's a basic requirement. So why is this called quarreling with Moses. They're in the middle of the wilderness. They need water. I mean, this is a basic human need. And they ask for the water. It's called quarreling, but I don't see where the quarrel is. I don't see where the disagreement is. It's called a quarrel in the text, but they're not quarreling. They are requesting something that they absolutely need. They ask for it 3 times before Adonai says, take the rod, strike the rock. I also think it's interesting that the water comes from the rock. The rock. I mean, the rock is symbolic, right? My rock and my redeemer. The rock of ages, right? The rock of your faith. I mean, this rock is the source of water. It's completely unexpected. Rocks don't give water typically, right? So there's something mysterious, magical, divine about this rock, this mineral thing that is now gushing forth water. Okay. And then the whole importance of being a rock of faith, right? Because clearly this is another test of the people, but are the people testing Moses? Or is Adonai testing the people? I'm not sure where the quarrel is, and I'm not quite sure if it isn't a two-way test.
Very, very, very interesting. I think you raise up a lot of really important questions. You know, don't they need the water in the desert? Isn't this a natural thing to ask for? Why is it a quarrel? And what exactly is going on? Why is this happening? You know, why? One could say, why didn't God just give them the water before they started being thirsty? You know, right? Why did, you know, it's like, you know, if I'm in the car and the kids are thirsty, I'm thirsty, and finally they start screaming and yelling, and then I give them water. My wife is going to say, why didn't you give them the water before?
Why'd you wait so long?
Okay, so let's see the Or HaChaim. With the Or HaChaim, Moroccan commentator, a medieval and somewhat mystical commentator. His commentary becomes very important among the Hasidim, the later Hasidim. And he moves from Morocco to Tzfat, to the north of Israel, and joins the Kubalim, the Kabbalists there. And where he lived in Morocco is still a pilgrimage site in Morocco. People still go on pilgrimage there. Israeli Moroccans will travel to Morocco to go to his and other kind of ancient graves. But he wrote extensively, and he's quite spiritual. So someone like to read this comment. Nancy, how about you?
Or HaChaim, the people quarreled with Moses, etc. The quarrel consisted of people demanding that Moses supply them with water. Seeing that it was clear that Moses was not in a position to supply them with water, the request was only the preamble to a quarrel. If the people had really wanted to ask Moses for water, they would have asked him to cry out to God, just as their successors did 40 years later in Numbers 21:7, when God had sent poisonous snakes against them. In this instance, they did not even ask Moses to pray after he had told them not to try God by quarreling with him. Alternatively, they demanded water much as a creditor demands repayment of a debt from his friend. It is somewhat strange that they use the plural, which I cannot read, all you give.
You all give, isn't it?
You all
not
give.
You as in a singular, but you all give.
You all, right. When demanding that Moses give them water, they use the plural when demanding that Moses give them water. After all, they spoke only to Moses. After all, they only spoke to Moses. We may therefore assume that they included God in their demand. This would also explain why Moses accused them of including God as someone whom they tried. When Moses mentioned God last, as in, why do you quarrel with me and with God? He meant that they knew very well that God was able to supply anything he wanted. Their sin was in doubting whether God was in their midst.
So not a total, in my mind at least, not a totally satisfying answer by Or Chaim in this first part, but interesting, right? It's the first part. He's saying, the Moses was not the one to approach. Why did he approach Moses? Why did he say Moses ask God? They're still not quite clear about their relationship with God, right? They're confusing God and Moses and not quite sure. And then the other point he makes, which is interesting, is they could have asked more nicely, right? You could have asked more nicely. They could have said, Moses, please, can we have some water? That's not the way. And they were speaking to Moses instead of to God. An interesting point. But let's keep going on. Nancy, please read Ibn Ezra, and then we're going to read the second Or Chaim, which I think is really interesting.
Ibn Ezra, and the people thirsted. When the thirst overpowered them, they raged against Moses and accused him of doing them evil and bringing them out of Egypt.
Sense of being overpowered, right? You kind of lose your cool, which you can understand. Thirst in the desert is not a pleasant sensation. It'd be easy to lose your cool. And so here the Or Chaim, this is why I wanted to bring this, because it answers your first part of your question. So let's read this last one, Nancy, and then we'll go back.
People thirsted there for water, etc. One cannot help wondering why God subjected the people to such a trial that they came close to dying of thirst. Most ordinary people would turn heretics if subjected to this kind of trial. Besides, it is even harder to understand Moses, who did not take the initiative and offer prayers on behalf of the people in their suffering, instead of crying out to God that the people were about to stone him in their frustration. Moses's prayer sounds as if he was insensitive to his thirst, concerned only with his own death by stoning. It appears that God's purpose in subjecting the people to this test was to train them to raise their eyes heavenwards, to pray and to implore God in times of need, because this is an important principle in matters of faith and attempts to perfect one's personality. You will note that God applied this same psychology when he allocated manna to the Israelites on a daily basis, instead of giving them a weekly or monthly supply at a time. He also denied them this miraculous bread until they had pled with him for sustenance. As soon as the people pleaded with God, he responded positively. Oh, okay. In our paragraph, we find that the Israelites contented themselves with complaining to Moses. They did not consider that their fate was subject to God's personal providence. As a result, their situation grew steadily worse, so that the Torah describes their thirst as overpowering. The Torah mentions that God tested them because they had not seen fit to request help from him. Okay, I get it now. When they asked if God were indeed in their midst or not, they demonstrated that they were not prepared to acknowledge that God guided their affairs by special providence. The only way God could prove that he was indeed in their midst was to allow the situation to become so critical that the people would learn to turn to him as a result of the intensity of their thirst. Moses realized all this. This is why he refrained from praying to God sooner.
So very, very interesting, right? The sense of God training them to turn to him, right? God was training them to turn only to God, and not to be stuck, and to learn to just have their relationship of faith.
Now, why would God want that? What's the hidden reason for God to create these trials? How does that? What's the purpose of that?
I mean, it creates relationship, maybe.
Well, is that in fact the way one gets a connection with God, is by pleading for him for things?
Well, there it's, well, there, the deeper your plea, the stronger the connection, perhaps. I mean, there are many ways of creating relationship, it's true, but a sense of dependence on God, a sense of depending, of turning, of having faith, developing faith. And we talked about this last week with the manna. Why did the manna fall every day and not, and why did it rot after one day? Different reasons, but one is the people had to learn. They were, as a slave, you're used to hoarding, you're used to thinking always ahead and worried, but he wanted to teach them a means where you're living in the present and just grateful for what you have. And when you need something, having this relationship of give and take with God, when you're in rhythm and attunement with the universe. But I agree, the suffering part doesn't appeal to me either. The God would make them suffer to learn that. But it's a training of some kind. I don't know. Anybody else have any thoughts about that?
Well, I was thinking that it's not just creating a relationship with God, but breaking or at least lessening the use of a human intermediary, that is Moses, as the intermediary between God and the people.
Mhm. Nice. Yeah.
Getting them to have a more direct relationship, as opposed to always feeling like they could only go through Moses.
In the beginning, Moses was chosen as the leader by God. And so eventually the people followed him. But why wouldn't they keep following Moses? And why wouldn't they ask Moses for the water? Because they'd been following him and all his instructions, thinking that he had, he was part of, he had this direct relationship with God.
Interesting. Well, maybe then if that's the case, this is a shift from that mode where God is trying to, up until now, they've really been separated from God. I mean, God made the plagues, but they were just doing their thing. They crossed the sea. That was the beginning, perhaps, when Nachshon walked into the water, that story of the water, of them. But maybe there is the beginning here of God wanting them to have a relationship directly with him, and not everything being through Moses.
Well, there's something to that, probably, at least in my thinking, with the hitting of the stone, by the way. The rock is one of the names of God. Okay, one of the formal, one of the formal names of God, Adonai, is rock. So hitting the rock, God opens up and delivers water. Now, from a deeper perspective, the water that's delivered is something that many people, or some people, experience internally when they're connected to the divine, some sort of watery light coming into them. Okay, so maybe the whole idea here is to try and get to the place where you have that kind of connection with the divine. You have to sort of give up to some degree your connection with the human interface of the divine, and go for the divine itself, as Alan will say, to get that.
Well, it seems very clear that God is taking them into a completely spiritual existence, right? They're eating manna, which is spiritual food, as we read, food that's supposed to slowly refine their nature, spiritual nature. Their very water is now dependent on God, on their prayers, on who they are. They're slowly being taken out of a very concrete, physical slave state of mind into a very spiritualized, completely not normal, what we would call normal, a very different kind of life, and it's slowly being brought to them. And it must have been a shock to the system. It's like you're used to living in a certain way, and suddenly you're, and they keep resisting. Like, give me back the concrete food, back the meat. I don't want this flaky spiritual. And the water suddenly now they're dependent on the water. So I want to go back. Judy, were you about to say something?
No, sorry.
Let's continue a little bit longer. Okay. Okay, Rabbeinu Bach, Morris or David or anyone.
Here I stand in front of you, there by the Chorev mountain. This rock at Rephidim was the same rock which we encounter almost 40 years later at Kadesh. This was also the source of the well of Miriam, which traveled with the Israelites through the desert during all those years. Compare Bamidbar Rabbah 1.2. The very word
Hineni.
Hineni, used by God prior to the rock erupting in a well, was the same as that used by God prior to releasing the manna from heaven. Just as the manna became a daily feature of the remainder of their trek through the desert until Moses' death, so the well, which appeared here for the first time, became the Israelites' constant companion, at least until the death of Miriam. Furthermore, just as the giving of the manna had been preceded by a revelation of God's glory, so the miracle of the rock erupting as a well was also preceded by the revelation of God's glory, seeing it was an ongoing miracle, just as was that of the manna.
So this is where the well of Miriam miraculously starts, because we don't find after this any more episodes of thirst. So this is where the Midrash comes in and says, well, Miriam created this miraculous well, which now follows them for the rest of their travels and gives them water. So just like the manna in Sinai, this is the beginning of being fed miraculously by having water and having food that just comes to you all the time. Interesting that it's the same rock, right? We know what happens next time when Moses encounters this rock, but at this point the rock is a positive thing, and I love that you both mentioned that the rock is the tzur, right? Symbolic of depending on the rock, and this is what the Israelites had to do: is learn how to depend on the rock for everything.
The rock also has physical qualities that are often attributed to some notion of the divine, which is stability and lack of motion, stationarity. All of this has to do with the rock, and this gives people some sort of sense of the divine too.
Well, it's interesting because, well, God, they were trying maybe to make God their rock. Everything else in their life was completely had no foundation, was completely under, so they didn't know where they were living. They had no house. They were traveling through the desert. Their food came every day. They couldn't collect food for the next day except on Shabbat. They depended on God and Moses for everything. So the only rock they had was their relationship with God. Everything else is completely up in the air. But
the rock had to be struck by the rod. The water didn't just come. So is that like the hand of God striking the rock?
That's
himself?
like being hit on the head with a ball-peen hammer. That's what that is.
Who's getting hit on the head? The rock, the God?
No, the
God is
Israelites.
No,
the Israelites.
but God is hitting itself on
No,
its
no,
head.
it's not. It's
If
not.
rock means
God
God,
is hitting
and rod,
itself
yeah.
on the rock. Well, God is also in the slaves and in the Moses. It's all a big play, all a big divine play. So let's go for it, because I do want to go ahead, Phil.
Thank you. It's interesting how it's Moses who brings up the idea that they're really testing God, because they're complaining to him, or I mean, it says there's a question about the text, but whether it's singular or plural, but anyhow, in our text it says plural, but mainly they say to him, they're disputing with him about the water, complaining, and he says, why are you testing me, quarreling with me, and why do you test God? Identifying himself with God in that respect, and pointing to God as the real person they're complaining about, and clarifying that issue in a way. I thought it was very striking.
And that's what the commentators were responding to before, when they were saying, why that was when they were complaining against Moses. That's why Moses was saying, you're not really complaining of me, you're complaining to God.
Rabbi, I wonder, is this kind of a continuation of what happened with the 12 spies? I mean, essentially, didn't God say, well, okay, you people, you didn't believe me.
Well, this precedes the 12 spies.
Oh, all right. Sorry, got it wrong. Okay.
This is before the 12 spies. This is the beginning of all the grumbling. We're going to see a lot more grumbling, but this is the first. It's like a pattern of grumbling, of crying out to God and grumbling and complaining, and then different reactions. But it's very interesting to note the different reactions they get at different moments, right? Here the reaction is God is upset or Moses is upset, but the water comes, right? Just like before they complain, and the manna comes. And later on, when they complain, God isn't always as charitable, right? The reaction starts to change to their complaining and their grumbling. Here, there's no punishment, right? There's zero punishment here. God relents, and they learn a lesson, but it's not. There's no consequence to them.
Getting back to Phil's point about the non-differentiation between Moses and God, how do you differentiate if there's an act like that? If an act comes through a miracle, how do you know that it wasn't the physical being of Moses and rather the non-physical presence of the divine? How can people tell?
Yeah, well, the prophet. This is the right. A prophet, and Navi is a messenger of God. So the prophet, to some degree, is an extension of God. When you speak, the prophet speaks God's word, and you speak to the prophet as if the prophet, is one with God on some level, right? He or she is united with God, so that it's God's messenger and God's presence. And right, the Avimelech says to Abraham, is Abraham a prophet or not? That's another question. But he says, God is with you in everything you do. So it sounds to us symbolic, but it might have been very experiential, feeling the God. You can feel God so clearly with Moses. And when you speak to Moses, you speak to you all, because you can feel that God is with Moses. But Moses isn't always, willing to take that up fully. I mean, there's still a personality there. I mean, it's a very interesting kind of thought of what that experience could have been like, right? To talk to Moses.
That would be a serious blast, right?
Yes. Well, and seeing how Moses could be quite fiery himself, the blast, you could get blasted back, right? Get blasted back, but then again, he might then hit the rock and make the water come out, which is a good thing, right? So you're playing with fire, but the fire might pay off. Let's continue, because I want to get to Amalek, because this is a really interesting continuation from where we are from this story to the next story. All right. So how do we get here? Okay. Here we go. Verse 8. Will someone read verse 8 to the end of the chapter?
Sure, I'll read.
Thank you.
Amalek came and fought with Israel at Rephidim. Moses said to Joshua, "Pick some troops for us and go out and do battle with Amalek. Tomorrow I will station myself on the top of the hill with the rod of God in my hand." Joshua did as Moses told him and fought with Amalek, while Moses, Aaron, and Hur went up to the top of the hill. Then, whenever Moses held up his hand, Israel prevailed. But whenever he let down his hand, Amalek prevailed. But Moses' hands grew heavy, So they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat on it, while Aaron and Hur, one on each side, supported his hands. Thus his hands remained steady until the sun set. And Joshua overwhelmed the people of Amalek with the sword. Then Adonai said to Moses, inscribe this in a document as a reminder, and read it aloud to Joshua. I will utterly blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. And Moses built an altar and named it Adonai Nissi. He said, it means hand upon the throne of Adonai, Adonai, will be at war with Amalek throughout the ages.
It's really a short episode, right? It's not that long, but it has a lot of life in our tradition because of what Amalek comes to symbolize. So let's look at the commentaries here. So this is just the Rashi. We're going to first look at the kind of plain meaning of what all this is about, and then we're going to get a little deeper. Anybody have any initial comments after reading that Amalek story, surprise or thoughts or anything?
Maybe you should ask the new student standing behind you.
Yes, yes. What do you think, Shava? Okay. So, right, pretty plain story. Amalek comes and attacks. Moses sends Joshua, and then Moses stands up on the hill, and somehow when his hands are up, they win against Amalek. And they win Amalek, but it's not enough for God. God is very upset with Amalek and says they must be blotted out. So what is this all about? So let's first see Rashi. Okay. Someone Rashi.
Scripture places this section immediately after the preceding verse. They say, is the Lord among us or not? To imply, I am ever among you and ready at hand for everything you may need. And yet you say, is the Lord among us or not? By your lives, I swear that the hound, Amalek, shall come and bite you, and you will cry for me. And then you will know where I am. A parable. It may be compared to a man who carried his son upon his shoulder and went out on a journey. The son saw an article and said, Father, pick that thing up and give it to me. He gave it to him. So a second time and also a third time. They met a certain man to whom the son said, have you seen my father anywhere? Whereupon his father said to him, don't you know where I am? He therefore cast him off from himself, and a hound came and bit him.
A little stark, but Rashi seems to be saying God was trying to teach the people a lesson, which was, am I with you or not? With the water didn't teach you, the manna didn't teach you. Let's have a little bit of a sharper lesson for you. This is the sharper lesson. The sharper lesson is Amalek came and bit them. Right, funny parable. Right, the son is on top, and he keeps badgering the parent. Give me this, give me that, and eventually you meet somebody, and he says, "Where's my father? Don't you know?" So he takes him off, and then the dog comes and bites him. It's a little sharp in my mind. Rashi can be a little sharp at times. He gives a traditional theology in a sharp kind of way. But now let's look at other aspects of the story, and then we'll come back to the whole a little bit later. And we're going to talk a little bit about this hands up in the air. What is this hands up in the air business about, right? What is that about? Moses' hands are up in the air and they're winning. And what does all of it mean? What is it all about?
Well, I think part of it is to show that Moses is only human, okay? That the hands up in the air and the tiredness associated with that is he's a human guy. He's not some sort of divine guy who is unembodied, but he actually has a body, and bodies have limits to them.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful.
But also that the humans have to be involved in this, that God didn't just strike Amalek, that the Israelites had to play their part.
Beautiful, right? He could have opened up the earth the way he opened up the sea, and it could have all been destroyed, right? But that doesn't happen. very much a partnership, right? It all feels like very much a partnership, this whole episode, right? Moses and gods and the people, very interesting. So let's see what Sforno has to say. Phil, would you mind reading Sforno for us?
Not at
And so
all.
the Hebrew is, there's a staff of God was in his hands, in my hand. Go ahead.
Thank you. To show the people what time he would be praying, in order that they too would coordinate the time, they offered their own prayers with that of Moses. The importance of this harmonizing of prayers is demonstrated when the Talmud tells us that in the large synagogue of Alexandria, they waved flags so that the people who could not hear the cantor could pray in harmony with him nonetheless. Sukkah, section 551.
Page 51. So it's saying that it wasn't just that there was some supernatural power in Moses, but when he put up his hand with his staff, the people knew, okay, we need to start praying at this moment and we'll pray together. Kind of an interesting idea, right? A little bit what this idea of partnership. I love the mention. There's a whole section in Talmud that will, I'll quote a little bit later. I think I brought into it. I can't remember if I did, but the synagogue in Alexandria in Egypt, according to tradition, but was so big that there were 1.2 million people inside the synagogue, and it was so vast that they couldn't hear the chazan. So they would put up a flag. They would say amen. And when they saw the flag, they knew they would say amen. And it's a really interesting little Talmudic piece. But it's kind of saying about what, Moses and the people, what Judy was saying, right? You're supposed to coordinate their spiritual selves, right? This is a partnership. The people had a part. And when they saw Moses, so let's keep on reading. Can you read Chizkuni too? Phil, you're on mute again.
Sorry. Yeah. Okay. Chizkuni. I will position myself on the summit of the hill. Moses wanted to be able to follow the course of the battle while personally watching, and even more, so that the Israelite fighters could see their leader and be encouraged by this visual contact.
Okay, this is a little bit more of a straightforward, rational. Chizkuni tends to be fairly rational.
He's like a conductor of an orchestra too. That's coming through here.
Very nice. And let's go to Malbim. Please continue, Malbim. Malbim is more recent, 1800s, but I think he's going to speak to what Judy was saying a little bit. Go ahead.
Oh, Malbim was that recent? I didn't know.
Moshe, yeah, Malbim is 1800s.
Moshe said to Joshua, Moshe's special abilities lay in the realm of the supernatural. For this reason, he conducted the wars against Sichon and Og personally, since those wars were openly miraculous. On this occasion, by contrast, Hashem hid his face so that they were required to do battle in a natural manner. Therefore, Moshe delegated command to Yehoshua, who had been chosen by Hashem to lead the conquest of Canaan, which was to be accomplished through natural wars, accompanied by hidden miracles. Nevertheless, Moshe helped in the battle against Amalek through prayer and urgings to repentance, in order that they would enjoy divine favor.
So we have a whole question there about, right? Is it supernatural or not, right? Malbim seems to be saying it's not, this is not a very supernatural episode, right? Moses was up there praying, but really he wanted them to, they were required to do battle in a natural manner. You seem perplexed, Phil.
Oh, I was trying to distinguish in my mind between the miraculous victories and the natural ones. And all I know, because I just don't remember about Sichon and Og, except in the Psalm of with the 136 against the, but I don't know why it was miraculous there and not here.
In the battles of Sichon and Og, the enemies are routed. There's no battle, so to speak. They're just routed by Israel.
Openly miraculous.
So it's, it's one of those battles where God just seems to fill the Israelites with tremendous strength, and the others are just, their courage is wiped away and they're routed. Here, this is a real battle, right? This is maybe the only real battle in the whole story of the desert. All the others, either Israel is routed or the others are routed. But so why here? Why here do we have a real battle? Why does God not just wage it completely for them? Maybe we were saying earlier, God is training them at this point to rely less, both to rely on Him. Yeah, it's a good question. If manna in the water was all about relying on God, here He's asking them to do more. Let's keep that thought and keep it analyzing. Okay, so Rashi, Nancy, would you mind reading for us Rashi?
Rashi. When Moses lifted up his hand, but could Moses's hands win the battle? So to see the whole passage as it is given in the treatise Rosh Hashanah 29a.
So I brought the Talmud, go ahead.
And it came to pass when Moses held up his hand that Israel prevailed. And when he let down his hand, Amalek prevailed. Exodus 17:11. It may be asked, did the hands of Moses make war when he raised them, or break war when he lowered them? Rather, the verse comes to tell you that as long as the Jewish people turned their eyes upward and subjected their hearts to their Father in heaven, they prevailed. But if not, they fell.
So, and they're all trying to analyze it. So Rashi's angle here is, it wasn't about Moses's hands. It was about when the people, and this is, we see why he could make this comment, because it's coming after the last two episodes, which were all about faith in the heavens, right? Manna coming from the heaven, the sewer, the rock. So here it's about, when they lifted up their hands and saw Moses and saw God, because their hands were lifted up, they were filled with God's power and they were able to wage war. But when they got scared, when they got fearful, they suddenly started to lose. Interesting comment by Rashi. You can see how he's trying to work it into everything else happening. Let's see what Rashbam. Rashbam is Rashi's grandson, and he loves to undermine his grandfather. So Nancy, go ahead.
Rashbam 11, whatever the Hebrew says, it is a psychological axiom that when the warriors see their flag being held aloft, they are inspired with additional courage. When they cannot see their flag being held aloft, they interpret this negatively and are liable to flee from the battlefield.
So Rashbam is always very, very rational, right? He's just saying,
this is a psychological commentary.
Yeah, which to me seems far from the text, right? Why would it, it can't just be, it's just that, they saw the flag and the staff and there's got to be more to the story. It doesn't seem to be, it's too rational, I think, for this story. And then Rashi continues. I think I love this comment by Rashi. Nancy, read this one too, please, if you don't mind.
And he was his hand's faithfulness. And Moses was in the condition that his hands were in faithfulness, spread forth to heaven in a confident and firm prayer. So
the actual Hebrew is interesting. Vayihi yadav emunah, and his hands were in emunah, right? In emunah, his hands were in faithfulness. We can go back to the text to look that up for a second. So that's okay. Let's see. I can tell. Let's see. Here we go. So they're interpreting it here. Thus his hands remain steady until the sun sets, but literally, and his hands remain faithful until the sun.
Hmm.
An interesting choice. The Torah, if the Torah did really mean just steady, it could have used a different word than faithful. I mean, it's interesting to use the word faithful to convey that. And so Rashi is picking up with it and saying Moses' hands, his faithfulness kind of created a firm prayer, right? Kind of like that concentrated prayer when you're meditating or praying and you're focused and something's coming through. So Alan, would you mind reading for us Ramban? So Ramban, Nachmanides, is like the first major commentary to really offer a lot of mystical commentary, but then it's taken up by others. So go ahead, Ramban.
Hey, by way of the truth, the mystic lore of the Kabbalah, Moses lifted his 10 fingers to the height of heaven. See Proverbs 25:3, in order to allude to the 10 emanations and to cleave firmly to him who fights for Israel. Here is Deuteronomy 3:22, for the eternal your God, he it is that fighteth for you. Here is explained the matter of uplifting of hands during the blessing of the priests and its secret.
So he's saying that what Ramban is saying, this was a very miraculous event. It was totally miraculous. And it was also about Moses learning his powers and learning how to turn to God to bring in that power. And the people they learned from this exactly what they learned through the manna, which is God fights for you, but you have to also make or Moses had to learn, you have to make your power firm. So let's look at Rabbeinu Bachya, who's 100 years, a little bit, I think about 100 years after Nachmanides, a little bit more, and he is even more Kabbalistic. So David, how about you? Do you want to read our
Kabbalistic approach. Moses raising his hands was a matter of his concentrating on his 10 fingers being pointed at what is called the Ram Hashim.
Shamayim, the heights of the heavens. The heights of the heavens.
And the next Hebrew is I can't do that without
the Kav HaEmsa'i, the middle line.
The Kav HaEmsa'i, the central of the emanations, which we discussed earlier, is known as the Ram with the vowel Sharak. This is alluded to in the words
Yarim Moshe Yado, he raised his hands. Yeah.
Yarim Moshe Yado, he raised his hands. He did something similar to what the priests do when they raise their hands in the priestly blessing. By concentrating on the number 10, they also concentrate on the 10 emanations and the source of blessing that flows from that region to disembodied spirits. At such a time, the power of any force opposing such prayers is checked and its influence halted, at least temporarily. That's a little flaky, I think.
A little what?
I say a little flaky, meaning not very substantial.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Well, maybe it's flaky like the manna that came down. You have to appreciate it. I mean, to me, it's like, Dave, you certainly correct me if I'm just totally off, I would think. To me, it's like a Neoplatonistic idea, which may be underlying there somewhere, that and then you have and then everything, all the imagery and all the numbers point in this direction of this of these different realms.
The Neoplatonism in the sense of energy coming down, right? The word channels for bringing energy into the world. So he's saying Moses, the part about the disembodied spirits I don't love either, but he's saying he brought up his hands in blessing, a little bit like the priestly blessing, and somehow this became a means of bringing divine energy into the world. That what he's saying is it stopped the negativity of Amalek, because Amalek is not just a physical enemy, but also a spiritual enemy. So it's kind of like this is a spiritual war that's happening at the same time, right? This is a spiritual war. And when Moses is focused, he's able to win that spiritual war against Amalek, an energetic war, a war of influence, and which which I think one feels in the undertext, right? Is something is happening there. And Moses getting tired, feels dualistic, right? There's something going on here. So Rabbi Bach is picking up on that. There was like a spiritual war going on, and the prayers are working when he's able to beat through that. And something is happening. And so I hadn't actually thought of that, but maybe this is why, if we look at it as a spiritual war, why God is so upset. Why is God so upset at Amalek? Because they're also waging a spiritual war. They're bringing a negative force against Israel that tires Moses out, but ultimately Moses is able to beat them. But it takes effort, and this creates.
What's the etymology of Amalek? If in the Hebrew, what sort of little words is it made up of? Amalek.
It's
Maybe
a
there's a
good
clue.
point. I don't. One of the commentaries brought it in, but I didn't look at it. But I can look at it now and see if we can find it. I don't remember. There's nothing that to me seems obvious. But we can pull it up in Safari and see if Safari gives us anything. Okay, so Amalek. Let's see. No, we read this one. There was someone who brought that. I can't remember who it was. Maybe it was in the Hebrew, but someone was commentating on it. So I might have to get back. Might have to get back to you on that one.
Okay.
Someone I remember was commenting on. Yeah, no, I'll look it up. I'll look it up, see if I can find it. But I mean, Amalek becomes symbolic of evil, right? Not just, but evil. So there's something powerful going on in this episode, and God, after all, asked him to blot out Amalek.
Yes, one of the 7 tribes that they have to utterly destroy.
Well, Amalek is even more than the other tribes because they're just idolatrous. I mean, they also are the ones that come up against Israel, but Amalek is just pure. It's right, Purim. It's Haman. It's So I kind of wanted to end our study. So we talk about Amalek and its evil and why they wanted to, and what exactly is going on here. Kind of a slightly different note, unless somebody wanted to continue talking about that aspect. But there's this interesting passage right at the end where it says, recorded in the book. Okay, what book are they talking about? What is this book? Recorded in the book. So this is an interesting question to the commentators. Sforno. So he's saying, Sforno says, a reference to the portion Deuteronomy. Wait a second, we haven't got into Deuteronomy. We haven't even been given what are we talking about here? So Ibn Ezra has a comment here. Maybe we'll just read a little bit of this, and I think it's a little bit interesting. So go ahead, someone read Ibn Ezra, please.
Write this for a memorial in the book. This chapter, verses 14-16, was said in the 40th year of Israel's sojourn in the wilderness rather than immediately after the battle with Amalek. The fact that scripture reads Ba-Sefer in the book with a patuk beneath the bet rather than Be-Sefer in a book is proof of the aforementioned. For Ba-Sefer refers to the well-known book that is the book of the Torah, which Moses completed shortly before his death. It is also possible that they had another book, and the reference is to that book rather than to the Torah. In this case, it is possible for this chapter to have been written shortly after the Exodus, known as the Book of the Wars of the Lord, see Numbers 21:14, which was lost to us, as were the Sefer HaYashar, see Joshua 10:13, and 2 Samuel 1:18, and the Midrash of Iddo, CF
Chronicles, Comb Fair Second.
Chronicles 12, 22, and the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel. See 1 Kings 14:19, 29, and the works of Solomon.
So many sephers.
So we're not going to read Hiskuni, we're just going to stop here. But this is an interesting point I want to bring up because it's what's called it's a little bit of a problem in the Torah. Wait a second, what is this referring to? What book? Is it some book that was lost that we don't have? There are mentions of other books that were lost. Or is it something else? Is it referring to, is this a book? Is this few verses mysteriously were put here, but really should have been somewhere else? And so it creates a conundrum for the commentaries to quite understand it. But I don't want to dwell there. We're gonna end here for now. So this is a journey of the Israelites up until Sinai, of being trained in faith, of being trained to rely on God for not completely, but to know that they had a relationship directly with God. They should pray to God. They should have faith, and to enter in this kind of alternative spiritual world where their spiritual lives are at the center and not their physical needs. And maybe that's what I take the most from it. That there, perhaps when we enter into a religious spiritual life, one has to go through a period where we turn away from our physical needs being the center and turn towards our spiritual needs. And that's an important part of that training and of that journey. At least it was for them, to going towards a different consciousness. But we'll see a lot more of this after the holiday, after receiving the Torah Mount Sinai, as we will, which for them really is the beginning of the new stage. And then we'll see how the rest of their journeys shape up and what they learn through all of it. Thanks for joining me.